I'm now joined by Ben Leo, the CEO of Fraym. Fraym has identified Africa's rising consumer class as young, moneyed, trendsetter, and untapped. Now, the emerging African middle class is predicted to spend $2.1 trillion in consumer spending by 2025. Ben joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ben. Let's begin perhaps with your main findings in terms of the identity of this young African middle-class consumer.
Yeah, based on forthcoming Fraym research, we've identified well over 330 million people across the continent that are in the upper and middle consumer brackets. For FMCG companies, they would understand these as A, B, and C1 consumers. And these are a rapidly growing and very sought after set of segments for consumer goods, whether they're beverages, household goods, personal care products. What we find is that about half of these consumers are in 4 more mature FMCG markets: Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. Of course, we have Nigeria, which has well over 50 million people in these segments. But interestingly, we find that there's 8 other African markets that have at least 8 million people in these sought-after segments, places like Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, and the DRC, just a few examples.
Yeah.
And with these very, very large numbers, the biggest operational questions become who are companies' best customers, exactly where are they located, and how should they optimize their distribution and marketing campaigns to drive sales and capture more market share.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about 330 million, I was just thinking at the back of my mind that that is larger than the population of the United States, so potentially more lucrative here. But you say they are people who are reasonably well managed. Let's talk about what they earn.
Well, the way that we segment markets in consumers is based upon the household assets that they own, which is a really reliable measure in terms of overall wealth levels, as well as the educational status and a range of other different factors. And we find that to be a really good way to compare consumers, not just within a particular market, but across markets versus a purely monetary measure, which is susceptible to a whole range of different challenges, whether it's seasonality or other factors that may not capture households or individuals' true purchasing power.
Yeah, and so I was also thinking about myself that the countries that you mentioned where these opportunities lie, so Algeria, Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, you also mentioned Nigeria, and looking at the African map, those are like polar opposites, if you like, because you've got the other 2 countries right at the top of the continent and one at the bottom, one at the extreme. Is access and distribution therefore becomes important, I suppose?
Yeah, it absolutely does, and this is where the importance of truly understanding where target customers are located, in what concentrations, to be able to feed that data, that information into distribution channels, as well as geo-targeted marketing campaigns. What we find even within a place as large, as vast as Nigeria, with 50 million of these highly sought-after consumers, is you definitely see pockets in different parts of the country, whether it's the belt that goes from Lagos down into the Delta or other locations where you're able to aggregate demand in a very geographically specific way and then feed that information in a very actionable way for distribution. Same thing for some of these other emerging markets that I referenced earlier, where you would be able to figure out where there are synergies in neighboring countries and be able to build go-to-market strategies accordingly. Obviously, you're going to need to reflect some of the nuances, which sometimes can be vast across different markets, but at least geographically, you're able to identify these kinds of clustering of consumers. But to be able to do that, This is where geospatial data and analytics come in, where you're able to move beyond the traditional lens that many companies have taken, which is a national lens, and be able to break up those markets into component parts and be able to bring them back together again, not only just within a national border, but across national borders in very sophisticated ways, which is where companies like Fraym come in.
Yeah. And in terms of when that potential is likely to be released, when do you see these vast amounts of money that we're potentially talking about being released? Is that now? Is that in the next 5 years? And what sort of growth rates are we talking about?
Well, why don't we take the Nigerian alcohol market as an interesting example of this?
Okay.
Over the last decade, Nigerians have nearly doubled their spending on beer and spirits and other alcohol products, which is very significant growth. However, what we find is that per capita consumption levels are still less than 1/6 that in South Africa. And so as consumption patterns or per capita consumption patterns and adoption rates continue to mature in a place like Nigeria, you're going to continue to see extremely strong growth. In the alcohol market, we see very similar things in places like Ghana, Tanzania, and Mozambique. And we also see it across the whole range of other consumer good categories. So I think what we are seeing is a significant uptick over the last 5 or 10 years in spending on some of these FMCG product categories. But as the incomes and wealth continue to expand and the consumption patterns continue to mature, we're going to continue to see very, very aggressive growth. And the most sophisticated FMCG companies are going to be using new data, new analytic tools to be able to capture as much of that opportunity as possible.
Yeah. And Ben, I suppose one of the things that I can say is I was in Nigeria at the weekend, and one of the things that struck me was that quality also, I suppose, is going to become an issue even going forward, because I was looking for a good wine with a friend of mine who wanted a good bottle of wine. And I can tell you what we found were cheap wine, if you like, but at prices that would shock you even sitting in San Francisco.
Yeah, I've experienced the same thing in places like Nigeria or Ethiopia or in East Africa. I think it's a very significant untapped market. Obviously, when we're talking about premium wine, it's going to be a smaller segment of the broader population. It's not a mass market offering, but nonetheless, there still are very significant untapped market opportunities for companies to go after. We've been talking with this example exactly in terms of premium wine companies in a couple of different places in East Africa who want to understand in a very granular way where that potential demand is, what the ability to pay is in terms of optimizing their price points, and then taking their product to market and growing it over time. So I think your example is a perfect illustration of market opportunities that aggressive companies and investors can capture in the coming years.
Absolutely. It points to the size of the opportunity. Thank you. That's Ben Leo, CEO of Fraym.